You are about to enter the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast on shockwaveskullsessions.com. And now your host, Bob Nalbandian. Greetings, everybody, from the Shockwave Skull Sessions studio here in San Lorenzo, located adjacent to Oakland, California. I am co-host and fake producer Matt Hartnett. And I know the last thing you all were hoping for was to hear my voice at the start of this podcast rather than that of the man himself, the myth, the classic metal legend, Bob Nalbandian. However, with that being said, the good news is this will, in fact, be the last week that you will hear myself or any other voice for that matter, because the Bob Father is officially no longer with us. You heard that right. Yes, Bob's real voice, that of the Huntington Beach hustler, the Armenian maven of metal himself, is finally back in full effect next week, as all systems are go. And I just talked to Bob the other night, and he's chomping at the bit to get right back behind that microphone where he belongs. And he even has a great podcast lined up for his full return next week that will no doubt satisfy you old school skullheads. So definitely make sure you subscribe to and download the podcast if you have yet to do so. Once again, we would like to thank everybody who has donated to the podcast. We hope you are enjoying your packages. And, we couldn't do this, as I've always said, without you guys. So thanks again. If you're interested in donating to the podcast, please send $20 or more to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail through PayPal, and we will send you a package of CDs and other swag to show our thanks and appreciation. If you haven't done so already, also make sure to go to our website, www.shockwaveskullsessions.com, and check out our new radio station, Shockwaves Radio. If you want to listen to some great hard rock and metal music from the 70s until today, go ahead and check that out. Just click on the Listen Now button on the top of the page. Costs you nothing, totally free, and we'll be doing a lot more with that station in the coming months, so stay tuned for more on that. And, of course, please check out our social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to find out more news and updates on the podcast and the website. And you can always listen to the podcast on our website, or also go to Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, YouTube, Podbean, Spotify, and more. And as always, if you have questions or comments, go ahead and send an email to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com. And so for this week, Bob has given me the keys to the Skull Sessions cockpit to host the episode you're about to hear, and I will be joined by a couple of co-pilots that includes frequent guest and good friend of the podcast who also hosted his very own Skull Sessions episode just a few weeks back. And, of course, I'm talking about none other than book author and host of the Classic Metal Show, Chris Akin. And our second guest is another metal podcasting heavyweight in the biz, and that's Joshua Toomey from the Toomey Podcast. He'll be with us as well. And just to give you a little preview of the podcast, Mr. Toomey, as many of you know, was in Primer 55, who are a big band in the new metal movement back in the late 90s, early 2000s. So we're going to talk to him a bit about the projects that he's been involved with over the years, and we're also going to talk to Chris about the pre-internet challenges that took place back in the 80s and 90s for bands who were based outside of the major media capitals in New York and Los Angeles. And he's going to talk about some of the necessary steps that these bands had to take in order for them to, catch the ear of record label reps and just the media in general back in those days. So, it's going to be a good one, and I hope you guys enjoy this episode. And, of course, we will also have an archive episode this week up as well that I know most of you will enjoy, especially if you're a new listener. The archive episodes are really just, they're really a great way for, obviously, our longtime listeners just to kind of rehash and listen to some of those old episodes that they enjoyed back when Bob started the podcast. And it's good for the new listeners, just for them to hear, the origination of the show and the vision that Bob had for this unique and fun podcast, that continues on here 12 years after its inception. So, yeah, it should be good. And, so once again, thank you all for your patience over the last month or so while Bob has been recovering. And hope you enjoy this episode, and we look forward to his return to the Skull Sessions throne next week. So welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Our first guest we have tonight is a very familiar voice who you all know by now and who we like to refer to here as our go-to guy and who is essentially the third spoke in the Shockwave Skull Session wheel, if you would say that. And that would be none other than book author and host of the Classic Metal Show, Mr. Chris Akin. What's going on, Chris?
Happy to do this, man. I love the topics that you picked tonight, and I'm ready to talk music once again.
Awesome. Beautiful. All right. Sounds great, man. And I'd also would like to welcome our second guest, who I'm sure many of you are also familiar with and who also conducts his very own acclaimed podcast, and one that I personally enjoy myself as well, and that's Mr. Joshua Toomey from the Toomey Podcast. What's up, Joshua? How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me on. I'm always down to talk some music, especially with you guys. Chris, not so much.
Gee, thanks.
Well, awesome, man. I appreciate you guys both, doing this on a Friday night. You guys are, I know, about 3 hours ahead of me here on the West Coast, considering that you guys are both located in the heart of the United States here, where you, of course, also do your podcast from. And both podcasts, might I add, are two of the most respected, and listened to, in the business when it comes to discussing and promoting hard rock and metal artists, which is really cool. And it's great to see, media outlets in middle, America these days, because it's definitely something you would have never seen, say 25 years ago if you were based outside of either coast. And, I say that because, most of the well-known and established media outlets, whether it be television, radio, record labels, so forth, these outlets were, and, they still are, mainly based on the coast, right? I mean, they're usually, not too far from the major, media markets. And by that, I'm talking about New York and Los Angeles. And, but there still is, and I believe always will be, sort of a coastal bias and sort of like an elitist view that the music media and their constituents have, towards Middle America when it comes to recognizing, talent that exists outside of, those media capitals. And, when I say bias, I'm referring mainly, to like a lack of connectivity and sort of a reluctancy or lack of interest that many, if not most, music executives in the media gave to bands and artists that were, not based on the coast or were also unwilling to relocate closer to the major markets. I mean, the traditional way of being discovered as a band or artist back in, the 60s and 70s, where it was basically, hey, if you wanted to make it, you had to move to New York, LA, or even back then London, right? I mean, Twisted Sister, for example, right? They got their break by moving to London, right? They slaved away in the clubs in New York for years, and, they decided to give it one last shot by going overseas, and, they eventually did get signed. And, you also saw the same thing in the 80s with bands like Poison, out of Pittsburgh, and a couple of the guys in Guns N' Roses, Axl and Izzy coming from Indiana. And, and you would very rarely see, A&R and music executives that were, willing to leave their little cozy and comfortable, bubbles and nests, in LA and in New York, to go out and find unique talent that, were outside of their comfort zones. And, but with that being said, and I'll briefly use an example that Bob had mentioned us, Chris, on the last podcast we did. We were talking about the band Last Crack and their sophomore release, Burning Time, and he had mentioned how when he was out Roadrunner, it was basically impossible to get any type of radio airplay or just, any type of serious media attention in the U.S. And, due to the fact that they were based out of Madison, Wisconsin, and not Seattle, at the height of the grunge movement in the early 90s. So essentially the program directors, the editors, they had very little interest in promoting a band from Wisconsin or anywhere else for that matter if they weren't based out of Seattle. I believe a lot of the A&R reps and labels that, they were trying to find, right, the next new Seattle right there. And then, after Seattle kind of reached its peak, right? They were looking for a scene or a sound that might connect with, rock and hard rock audiences, especially with the major labels. I mean, those major label execs, they were so disconnected to what was really going on musically across the country that they had to rely more on the independent labels like a Sub Pop, out of Seattle, for example. And then they would do these P&D deals, these product and distribution deals with them, in order to find out what the newest thing was and where they should focus their resources, on. Meanwhile, it was the independent labels who were the ones, who were risking themselves financially, as they always do, by taking a chance on these lesser-known independent bands, while the majors just kind of sat back and they waited to see what was catching on with the audiences, and then they would just come in for the kill shot, sign these bands, away with big lucrative offers, and these bands couldn't turn them down. Obviously, in order to make the next step forward, they went ahead and took those deals. And I think, so essentially in a nutshell, these major labels, they went in and sort of, I guess you could say, stole these bands away from the independent labels, who were the ones who were down in the trenches and, they were getting snagged up by the majors and I totally understand the bands doing it. But, and Chris, I know you were involved in something along those lines yourself that you're going to talk about in a little bit. But, Joshua, I wanted to, I know you have personal experiences in this area yourself as a musician coming out of Tennessee, and Kentucky area there, where there was a burgeoning scene that was going on in the late 90s, early 2000s. I mean, of course, Memphis and Nashville, both iconic cities for both blues and country, but neither one of them was sort of synonymous with hard rock and metal, in my opinion, right?
I remember, being in the scene back then, and we would go and we would play shows, and, the businesses were all there. We could go down Music Row and see, BMG and Capitol Records and all of the major labels were there. It was their country divisions, but it was obviously all the labels were there in Nashville. The other thing that we always had at our disposal too were all of these great studios that were ran by rock guys mostly, but they were all making their money in country. So we were able to kind of get, little backdoor deals and stuff like that to record really good demos, things like that. But yeah, man, it was tough kind of trying to come out of Nashville back, pre-internet days. Well, the burgeoning, the very, very, very beginning of the internet and being able to kind of do Messenger and things like that. But trying to get out there back then was definitely hard to get out, especially in the metal bands coming out of Nashville.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know most people are familiar, with you musically. I know you were the bass player for a while for Primer 55, who was, one of those bands that was scooped up by a major. I believe it was Island, right? I think Island Records they were really hardcore into your guys' scene there, right? Because they signed a bunch of bands out of there, right? I mean, they signed, I think it was, Saliva and Full Devil Jacket, right? I mean, all those bands out of Tennessee. Mm-hmm. And with you guys, I remember, it's been a long time, but I did, when I was starting up my label back in about 2001, when I was thinking of doing it and I was looking into it, I actually came upon a band that you were in at the time, 12 Volt Negative Earth. Right. Which was, not to blow any smoke up your ass, but, that was that Baby Steps EP was awesome. And, I remember talking to you and you were telling me that, you guys had some interest with Roadrunner. They had been in contact with you and so forth. And, the only other, I guess, the only reason why I could think of why you guys were not, signed or by them or, other than the fact that Roadrunner was they were very well known for dishing out really shitty deals to new bands. So you guys probably didn't want to sign with them anyway at the time, but, it was also because
I would have signed if Roadrunner gave me a toilet paper roll to sign. I would have signed it.
Yeah, but I mean, the thing about Roadrunner at that time too is they were often running with Nickelback at that time, right? And so their business model had kind of changed, and they became focused, I think, more on capitalizing on more the radio friendly, rock and metal that was coming out. And you guys were really a pure metal band. You guys, I don't think were very radio friendly in terms of what they were probably looking for at that time. But I mean, you guys, I think 12 Volt Negative Earth was, I think, a great example of a band that was kind of, in that zone. You were in this area where, I mean, I guess you probably couldn't really, get your music out as much as you would like to. I mean, in terms of touring, I mean, was there? Well,
I mean, that was the one nice thing about being in Nashville, because in Nashville, every direction, north, south, east, west, about 3 to 4 hours away is another, at least a big city, St. Louis, Memphis, Atlanta, Louisville, Knoxville, and then we would go up the coast. We would go to New York. We would go to, Cincinnati and Indianapolis. I mean, that's the one nice thing about being in that part of the country is you could, I would book these, 3-4 day weekend basically runs, go down Memphis, Jackson, Mississippi, New Orleans, come back up through Atlanta, things like that. So, I mean, that's the one nice thing about being in Nashville is just so centralized everything. And, Atlanta's like, about 4 hours away. And we would do stuff like that all the time.
Oh, okay, cool, man. Yeah, and Chris, I know in your experiences, from more of a business and media perspective, I know you've been a big media voice and figure, within the Midwest, for the last 25 years or so, especially, mainly, obviously more specifically in Cleveland and Ohio in general. And unlike Tennessee, right, Ohio is and has always been really a hotbed for hard rock and metal, music. I remember working at Roadrunner for a little while back in the 90s, and they used to give me like a list of places that, to send, packages out and to call, these spots and just let them know that, to expect a package, and we, let them know which bands we were promoting and so forth. And every time I get one of these lists, it would be record stores, tattoo shops, head shops, whatever. I would say 70% of the 70% of the places on the list were basically out of Ohio, especially out of Columbus. That was like a huge spot. I know for you, as a guy who's worked in radio and music, for all these years, and you're not based in LA or New York. I guess give us maybe your take on what you witnessed and experienced throughout the years in terms of dealing with the coastal bias among a lot of the music media at large.
Well, there always was that here in Cleveland, especially during like the late 90s through about 2002, 2003, I guess. So maybe 97 to 2003, seemed like every band that was worth a shit had a deal. And they were all little deals. They were, it was with Gotham Records or, these smaller labels. And the whole purpose to having those label deals was to get showcases. That's what everybody wanted to do. They felt like they couldn't get a showcase unless they had somebody sign them. So it's like it gave them more credibility. And for some part that was true. I have a friend, me and Toomey have a mutual friend named John who was in a band called Gatlin. And Gatlin, every time they would play, they would sell 800 tickets. Every time they would play. Wow. 800 tickets, they would sell a big room, and they would play like every 3 months. It wasn't like they were playing once a year. Every 3 months they were playing the biggest room, of the club scene. Mm-hmm. And they begged and begged and begged and begged and begged to get a showcase. And it took them well over 2 years before they could ever get a showcase. And then when they got a showcase, the guy stayed for one song and bailed. So that, it was a total waste of time. But the deal was that they were satisfied because they got that showcase and at least got to go to New York and play and let some A&R people see them. By contrast, there was another band from here called Agatha Crawl, and they were fantastic. If you ever want to look up a band on YouTube that was excellent, should have been a big band. They signed with Gotham Records, and as soon as they signed with Gotham Records, they immediately got the ear of somebody at Atlantic and a guy that's making noise now, who used to just kind of be an A&R rep, Tom Hazart, who works now with David Ellefson and all his projects. Mm-hmm. They got his ear. They got Atlantic Records ear. Atlantic came out here to see him. They got a tour. They toured the country, and and then it just didn't sort of happen. But the only reason that they got any attention at all was because they got that tiny deal that really was a half step above selling CDs out of the trunk of your car. Mm-hmm. It really wasn't such a big deal. But I think what I always saw, especially when I was doing the metal show on WMMS, I dealt with all the publicity people and I dealt with a lot of A&R people, and they were. The thing about the coasts was that the coasts were always looking for the hot band of the minute. And, from Cleveland, obviously Chimera made a lot of noise out of Cleveland. Mm-hmm. And they made a lot of noise because Slipknot made a lot of noise. Mm-hmm. But then when I would get my calls from publicists on either coast or from A&R people on the coasts, their questions were, who do you know like Chimera? Who do you know like Slipknot? They were just they weren't trying to find anything original. They were trying to pilfer the like sounding bands, the bands that would come up behind the local band that made it, mm-hmm. and imitate them. So, I did see that even when the A&R people came from the coasts to my town, to Cleveland or Columbus.
And these were the major label A&R guys you're talking about? Yeah. Okay.
It used to be Atlantic or we had a WE office here as well, and they used to as Warner Electra Atlanta, and they would scope out who was the next thing, but the purpose was always to kind of bring them back to the coast. I think the reason that they always wanted to take that the bands on the coasts were signed so much more. Mm-hmm. I think it's probably less now, but back in those days, I think it was so much more because there was artist development, which there's not anymore.
True.
Mm-hmm. And when there was artist development, where these guys, they wanted to be able to make a phone call and have somebody drive, up Ventura Boulevard and be in the office in an hour so that they could work on their look or their sound or their video or their presentation or what they're going to say in question and answers on the radio. And, they wanted those people close to them. So they signed bands that were close to them. And, and it was with varying success. I mean, I think every one of us, Toomey, I know you do, and Matt, I'm sure you do too, has 100 records in your collection that if you name the bands, nobody would know them. But you think they're better. You think that if you name the like band, you think they're better than the like band that had success. It's just kind of the way it was. I think it's changed somewhat now because the labels don't seem to have any real clout anymore. Sure. The internet has really leveled the playing field. But man, there was a lot of missed opportunity there in those 80s, 90s, 2000s. A lot of bands that should have been big. You could have a whole different sound of what is rock and roll today if they wouldn't have been so stubborn as to just look only within 50 miles of their desk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, did you guys within those between Tennessee and Ohio? I mean, were there a lot of independent labels that?
Yeah, there was that was a whole nother thing in the late 90s, and to me, I would love to know if it was the same where you were, but for a while, those that couldn't get a deal would form their own label, and then you had that label. We had Cleveland Metal Records, and we had Cleveland International, and we had Rust Records, and there was like everybody had a label at some point, and again, it was all just bullshit that was just trying to convince. It was just a line item on a one sheet when they would send their press kits to Roadrunner, Atlantic, or Warner, or whoever it was, saying, yeah, these guys took interest with us. Now it's your turn. Mm-hmm. And that's really how it went. And in the even on the coast, there was a lot of those little small labels that were getting some steam at that time. Mayhem Records and Gotham Records, and obviously Century Media at the time was not a big label. It wasn't until, I don't think they blew up until Stuck Mojo hit their lot, really. But there was just so many of those labels there for a while that would pick up bands, and you would see bands that you would sort of know that would kind of pass through there. Propane is an example. Sure. We've all heard of Propane. Absolutely. Propane, I remember when Contents Under Pressure came out, which I still think is their best record, and I believe that was on Mayhem Records.
It was on Mayhem, yeah. Mayhem was definitely one of those labels. I think they had Propane. They were based out of New York. I remember, they were gone in a couple of years though. I mean, they folded real fast, like a lot of obviously independents do.
Sure.
And Josh, what about down in Tennessee there? I mean, how was?
At the time, I mean, everyone's label was like their grandma, because she would loan you $1,000 that you could go press 1,000 CDs at the local place. I mean, that's what we did for our first two albums, where it was basically just we were the label, selling it at going consignment at Tower Records and all of the little podunk record stores and things like that. And it was one of those things where if we had a barcode at the time, it probably would have shown up on a few sound scan type things, like, hey, this band 12 Volt Negative Earth is selling X amount of CDs in Nashville, but you're selling them at the Great Escape, used record store and at the counter, and they keep calling saying they can't keep them in, but that no one knows about it, so you're kind of lost in the shuffle there. it's funny going back to something Chris was talking about with John Drake's band going to showcase in New York. I remember, TVT Records was one of the first labels to reach out to 12 Volt, and we drove up to New York with the big high hopes of getting signed, and we put on probably one of the worst shows we ever played, and like there was no one in the venue. Chris, do you know the band, the bass player from Tesla's other band? It was like Soul Motor or something.
Oh,
we ended up opening for them, and there was nobody there for them. There was nobody there for us, and the lady left, halfway through the show, and then later on I asked her, why she left, and she was like, "Oh, my friend had tickets to a Knicks game," and I'm like, "Man, we drove 20 hours up here, and you can't even give us the common courtesy of like a handshake after the show." I was so upset with that.
Yeah. So whatever happened with 12 Volt Negative Earth? If you don't mind me asking, because like I said, I personally, I think I was telling you, I was starting up my label. I heard you guys, and I kind of found you basically through the internet. You guys were all over, Blabbermouth and all, the PRP, a lot of those sites.
Right. And
when I heard Baby Steps, I was like, well, this is, this I think is definitely a band that's going to wind up doing something. And like I said, I remember, you telling me about the Roadrunner thing, and it's kind of funny because I actually was planning on starting my label. I was living in San Diego at the time. And after speaking with you, I remember thinking, because I had there was no way a band at that time like you guys were going to sign on to a fledgling label like myself, who had was starting from scratch. But yeah, did you guys? I know there was, I think, a later incarnation of the band, right? That started in the late 2000s. I believe it had Chris Cale in it, right, from Five Finger Death Punch.
Yeah, he ended up replacing me in right at about 2002, 2003, when I left to join Primer. Basically what happened, and unfortunately, about the time that you reached out, that would have been about 2001. We were basically at that time, the band had been together since '96, 5 years of struggling, not getting anywhere, and we were all kind of frustrated with the whole ordeal. And then our friend Lennon got signed to Arista Records, and if you remember her, she was kind of a pre-Evanescence metal chick. Like they needed a metal band to kind of rewrite her piano singer-songwriter songs. So she reached out to me, who I reached out to my guitar player, reached out to my drummer, and basically we ended up being her backing band. So it got real squirrely right around that time. And then I actually ended up going on tour playing bass for her for a little bit, went back to Nashville, kind of felt like I'd seen a little bit more of the world of, actually being a band. So we continued on 12 Volts. We did a few more demos here and there. And then actually once I left to join Primer, Chris Cale now, he ended up joining the band, replacing me. And then they put out one more EP, and then pretty much by that time it had been like 6-7 years of just nothing. So we peaked and then fizzled out. Took a long fizzle out.
Yeah. Well, like I said, you guys, I recommend to our audience here for anybody to go out and check, go online and check out your guys' music, because I think it was definitely one of those bands that we're talking about now that just got overlooked, and possibly because of the connection to not being close to the coast and so forth. Maybe I'm overstating that a little bit, but I feel just from personal experiences working, at some labels both in LA and in New York, and just seeing a lot of the attitudes of a lot of the people that work there and a lot of the executives. And like I said, obviously, a label like Roadrunner and Monty Connor and his team, as I was saying earlier, when I think about them especially, they were, at the forefront, I think, a lot, with a lot of bands that, came out of the Midwest and so forth. I look at, West Virginia, right? You had Carmen of Burn that came out of there, signed with them. You also had a band like, they weren't on Roadrunner, but Byzantine. I remember Century Media, they signed Chum, this band Chum. There was pretty, if you guys remember them, and that metalcore band, Zao. A lot of bands were coming out of there. So there was a lot of, it was interesting there in the 90s. There was a lot of little scenes that these labels were just trying to, turn into the next Seattle. Another one that comes off the top of my head was out of Lawrence, Kansas. You had Stick, Paw, and Kill Creek. Those three bands, right? I mean,
Right.
they were. I actually loved. I think Stick. That was a band I really thought that kind of. I think they were on Arista, if I'm correct. They were signed to them, and they had that. Obviously, they were like a grunge sounding band, but they were really more of an alternative metal. I was just actually listening to that record yesterday, and it still, I think, is one of the most underrated, albums that came out around that time. What's some of the bands or some of the the scenes that you guys kind of came across that you think kind of maybe got overlooked? Or
I mean, the one scene that obviously not overlooked, but the one scene that we actually went, my guitar player and I went up to Chicago, and we actually scoped out some houses. We were going to rent a band house and stuff like that, and that was the late 90s or maybe even early 2000s, when you had Disturbed and From Zero and all of those Chicago bands were kind of getting signed. Mm-hmm. And just to piggyback on something you were talking about earlier, the one thing I found in doing the Talk to Me podcast and kind of talking to my peers, because I knew a lot of ththose bands like Spine Shank and all those bands that got signed back then that may or may not have done anything. And the one constant that I find is 12 Volt actually was probably doing more business than a lot of the bands that got signed. We just didn't. It always seems like it's like they met one random lawyer, one random music publicist or something that had one connection, that was like one person away. There was a story the other day of I can't remember the band, but they only had 5 songs and they got signed. And Primer was kind of an example of that too. Primer just had the one EP out that Bobby said he had left a cassette in a recording studio. The next band through, his manager picked it up, put it in, liked it, and the next thing they're signed. Mm-hmm. So it's such a crapshoot, this whole music thing. And for 12 Volt was, at the peak, we were doing 1,000 kids a show. Some of these bands that I've talked to that have gone on to be way bigger than a lot of the bands that we came up with when they got signed weren't doing anything near that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just made a good point about sort of some of these bands getting signed on a whim. I mean, one that comes to the top of my head is also the band Mother's Day Out from Arkansas. I mean,
right.
That was one of those ones. The same thing. I think it was the A&R guy. I think it was Chrysalis. He was. Just happened to be in town or something. There was some sort of festival going on, and sure enough, he just happened to be there. He saw this band, liked him, and signed him out of nowhere. I mean, that was sort of, and that just shows you, I think, sort of it's just sort of, I don't want to say how out of touch a lot of the major label, A&R, some of those guys were in terms of what was going on. They just kind of would go somewhere, see a band, oh, I like them, let's sign them, right? I mean, it was just there was really not a method to that madness, right? It was just sort of on a whim. And like you were mentioning, and I think of a couple other bands like, I know like Century Media, like I said, they started doing that as well. I mean, like we were saying, they had Chum, Haste. I remember they signed Haste. They were out of Alabama, right? Sure. Especially in the Midwest there, right? You had all those, I mean, it seemed like every state, they would go in and poach one band out of, right? Minnesota, you had American Head Charge, mm-hmm. and then, you'd go into, Indiana a little bit later, right? They had, Days of the New, and, in Kentucky, you had Tantric, and then you had, up in Michigan, you had Taproot, Workhorse Movement. You had a whole bunch of these bands that would just, it was just sort of like, all right, let's just go and we'll sign one band of every state and just see how it goes. It just seemed like there was really no method, right, to any of that stuff. Yeah.
Well, that's the one thing, one of Chris and I's favorite bands, and I'm, sure yours is too, but I mean, Pantera is one of those that, they basically, got turned down by every record label 30 times, mm-hmm. and then they play a birthday party at a roller rink, and the Atco Records guys there and wants to sign them up. So, you can put all of this time and effort into it, and next thing you know, you're playing someone's birthday party at a roller rink, and you're the kings of metal for the 90s.
Yeah, no, I know. It's times have definitely changed, that's for sure. I mean, but at least it was pretty cool because before that, I mean, there was they got no attention, these places, right? I mean, so at least it was maybe a sort of a phony attempt at showing that we're going to reach out to these areas and try to look for other talent. But it's really interesting, just how over the years there's just been so many bands that really had to relocate. I mean, if you go back to the 80s. In the Bay Area up here, you had DRI coming from Houston, in the middle of the whole crossover, period. Then you had Metal Church that came down from Seattle. You had the Melvins, they came down from that area. Slough Fag, that was another sort of classic, metal band that came from Pennsylvania. Yeah, it's pretty interesting, and it's like not like Chris, you were saying nowadays. I mean, really, this stuff's all out the window. There really is no. I mean, they said there's no artist development whatsoever. Right. So it's really based. I mean, major labels barely even sign any hard rock and metal bands as it is anymore, and there's just nothing for them anymore, right? I mean,
no, there's not. It's just a different game now. Now if you can, it's funny because now when I talk to bands like either unsigned bands or even small bands that are signed, but they're just, they're not on the whatever the big level is today. The thing they're all looking for now is to get into independent movies, to get their song as the end trailer on a movie or something, because that seems to be the new showcase. Is if you could say, 3 seconds of my song was played in a Netflix show or something like that. It has completely changed now, and I want to go back to a band that you mentioned, Matt, that for the life of me, I can't figure out why they were not big. Well, I can, because they kind of shot themselves in the foot, but the best band, and I'll argue this all day long, the best band that came out of that 90s, the worst band that came out of it and had success was Clutch to me. I can't stand Clutch.
Oh, I love Clutch, man.
Watch your mouth, Chris.
I know, really.
Neil Fallon's voice makes me want to put my head in a microphone.
Man, he's one of my favorites.
Oh, I can't stand. But nice guy. Nice guy. But that being said, that style of music all of a sudden blew up at that moment when Clutch had Elephant Riders and everybody had it, and it obviously propelled that music. And then Karma to Burn was out right about the same time and got nothing. I know. And I mean, they have like 10 albums or 8 albums or something. They're all great. Mm-hmm. They're so far superior. The bands that did make it, your Clutches, your Monster Magnets, whatever. And I'm not shitting on like Monster Magnet, and really not Clutch. It's just not my thing. Mm-hmm. But, all of those bands or Karma to Burn, I'll take Karma to Burn over any one of them. But Karma to Burn, if they did, the one thing that I think they did wrong was the way they named their songs. They made it impossible. They made it impossible to know. I mean,
to remember them,
and I can't tell you, because they named all their songs are just numbers, and not even in order. It's not like 1 through 10. It's like track 1 is 53 and track 2 is 74, and there's no way to remember it. And I think it killed that band, but they immensely talented. And it's funny because when you look back at that time too, there were so many great bands that didn't get a sniff. That Karma to Burn is one that at least got a chance. But you look at like 5 Horse Johnson or 60 Watt Shaman or bands like that. These were great bands and just couldn't get the time of day. And they were all signed on little tiny record labels. I know 5 Horse Johnson was on Sin Club Records out of Columbus for a minute. I mean, they were on some nothing label.
Yeah.
And I think 60 Watt was on CMC International or something.
Yeah.
They were on
that whole stoner rock. I think that the problem with that scene at that time in the 90s was, that was totally burgeoning, but it was so underground. I mean, for instance, like Karma to Burn, for instance, Roadrunner took, signed them. And I remember for a hot minute they had signed Leadfoot, which was a couple of the old guys from Corrosion and Conformity. And they dropped those guys, though. The next thing, I think they got picked up by the Music Cartel or something. Right. But I remember actually working at Roadrunner when that album was coming out. And the next thing you know, they just stopped. Roadrunner just dropped all those bands. I mean, Karma to Burn, like you said, you correctly stated, though, they definitely shot themselves in the foot. I mean, I remember going to see them in New York, and I was, so excited. It was the first time I was going to see them, and they never showed up. They just never showed up. And a lot of it was to do with, their singer that they had on that first album, which I thought was great. And I guess to them, they just weren't into the singer. They just weren't into singers in general. And that's to me the reason why I think they never took off to begin with is, they did try out John Garcia from Kai's there for a while. He did a couple, I think a demo or so with them. nothing became of it, I guess. But yeah, they were also very, I think, a couple of the guys were kind of heavily into substance abuse at the time too. So they had, like you said, they just shot themselves in the foot. They had a great opportunity, but they were just so hard to work with because they refused to get a singer after, the singer on that album that they did on Roadrunner. He was just a friend. He wasn't even like really just. They just said, "Hey, you want to sing for us? Cool." And he put together some vocals, which I think actually I thought were fantastic. It was so different. It was like an avant-garde type of sound. But yeah, going back to that stoner scene, I think it was because I think with the hard rock and metal out at that time, you had the whole new metal scene that just took off. And then it was just sort of like, okay, we're going to leave all this other stuff behind. But what's interesting about that is that now, about maybe 20 years later, 15, 20 years later, that stuff is completely now like some of the biggest, music that there is out there, the whole stoner and doom stuff. I mean, that is really what's hot right now amongst the, the younger, generation of hard rock and metal fans. And, but you were right, though. I mean, there was so many good bands that, like you said, 60 Watt Shaman and, Atomic Bitchwax is a great band, another one. So many of them just got, completely overlooked and dunked. But it is nice to see those bands really kind of get more, credit now, even though it's 20 years later. They're able to sort of salvage a little bit of, what they did have in their career beforehand. And, they're starting to at least get some notoriety from what they did, in the past and stuff. And
you know what's interesting too is most of those bands are still together.
I know, it's amazing. Yeah.
Karma to Burn just put out an album, I think, a year ago. Mm-hmm. Five Horse Johnson, I know, is still around. Obviously, Monster Magnet just put out a record not too long ago. Atomic Bitchwax, they seem to come back every 5 years or so with a record. Mm-hmm. Most of that stoner, there's something about that stoner scene that, I think really because it's only about 25 guys and they just alternate between bands.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
John Garcia, who you mentioned, how many bands has that guy been in?
Hermano
and his solo stuff and Vistachino.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That guy's in every band, but it is cool that style is. I personally am thrilled that you're getting bands like Rival Sons and I don't know, Scorpion Child and stuff like that are definite offshoots of that stoner. It's like the next level of that stoner thing. It's good to see that it may have taken a while, but it came together. There's other styles that have not been so lucky, like thrash as an example. If you look at the thrash bands that came after the initial wave, the Testament, Exodus, and Anthrax, and blah blah blah. There really has not been a solid wave. I mean, yeah, you've got bands, you've got 2 or 3 that are out there right now. Your Municipal Waste and Havoc, and
Toxic Holocaust,
Lazarus AD, yeah.
And their bands, Hatchet and stuff, but those bands really didn't have any kind of success like they should have. There's a band, you want to talk about bands from the Midwest that should have made it. Are either of you familiar with Lazarus AD?
Yeah, I actually just said that. Yeah, from Wisconsin, right?
Oh,
yeah, awesome.
That might be the best thrash band that's ever released a record. Mm-hmm. Their Monolith record is unfucking believable, and it didn't get 2 seconds of airplay from anybody.
Nobody.
Came out the same time as Havoc and Warbringer and them all came out right around the same time, and everybody gravitated to Warbringer and Havoc and not them. And you want to talk about it? If they would have moved to one of the coasts, I think they'd still be making records today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think me and Bob have mentioned another. You're right though with the whole thrash. I think a lot of the newer thrash bands, the post 80s, thrash bands. I think a lot of it's maybe just because there's not a lot of originality. I think in a lot of those bands. Like, I mean, I love one of my favorite thrash bands, the newer thrash bands, is Power Trip. That band. Oh, yeah. I mean, in live they're even better. I mean, it's interesting. Their recordings, they have this sort of they have that old school sort of 80s sound. It sounds like old Sepultura recordings. It has like that kind of sound. And, but when you see those guys live, I mean, they're just unbelievable. And I think it's just because, I mean, I don't know if it's, me and Bob saw that band. What was it? Hatred. That's Steve Souza's son's band.
Yeah.
And they were a good band, but there's just no teeth to it. There's nothing, original about it. It's just the same type of vocal sound, same, there's just, to me, I just think, a band like, yes, Power Trip, Lazarus AD, those are two, I think, exceptions to the rule. But I think, like you said, the Hatchets, the Havocs, the Warbringers, there's nothing really, I think, new that they're bringing that's going to get anybody excited. That's going to, especially with, I think, the older thrash bands, thrash fans like ourselves, maybe the younger fans might like them a little more, but I think they just haven't been able to connect with, guys like ourselves who love that old thrash stuff,
Sure. And it would be nice, though, if some of the old bands would take some of these bands out.
That's another thing. Yeah.
That's a whole nother thing that has really fallen by the wayside, is that and that's in every musical genre. For whatever reason, Metallica's taken out Cage the Elephant instead of somebody that sounds like Metallica. Exodus is just, they don't take anybody. They just play with whatever opener the local promoter puts in front of them. And it would be nice if they would introduce us the way we learned, I learned anyway, as a kid from the 80s. Half of the shows that I went to, I would see 2 or 3 bands that I'd never seen before. And the next day I'm in the record store either buying or stealing their tapes.
Yeah.
Look out, Kmart.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think also a reason for that, though, I think, is because, right, you see all these bands, like whether it's Exodus, these guys are all touring with each other, right? You've got a package tours now going on with, you got, Exodus playing with Testament, just a typical, those bands that were always playing with each other. They're still doing these package tours with each other, which I guess it's just more financially, lucrative for them, right? If you take out a lesser known band that no one knows, you're probably not going to get as much of a draw, right? But if you're going out with 3 or 4 bands that have been established for, 20, 30 years, I think you're just going to get a bigger draw. Whereas, if a band like Exodus takes out 2 or 3, 2 unknown thrash bands, it's probably not going to draw, right? Because the younger generation just aren't going, to shows like we did back in the day. It's just not happening.
Yeah, but I would argue back and forth, especially with this one example anyway, that you could put together an Exodus, Death Angel, Hatriot show, and that would be just fine. And they wouldn't have to pay Hatriot shit because Zetro's those kids' dad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
well, I think the perfect example of what we're talking about just happened, with Flotsam and Jetsam here in Louisville. Was Flotsam and Jetsam came through with the band Dead by Wednesday, somewhat of a name. I have heard of them, obviously, but not a huge name. And there was not a ton of people there. Like I think I texted you, Chris. I think there was like 40, 50 people there tops. Yeah. And Flotsam and Jetsam was so good that I was thinking, I was like, man, they need to be like, the second to the top. They need to be opening for Testament with a lesser known band maybe opening, but I don't think Flotsam should have been headlining, but they were so good that they would be perfect on a package like an Exodus, Death Angel, Flotsam kind of tour.
Yeah. It's just somewhere along the way, and I don't know when it happened. I'm going to say in the 2000s-ish, because even in the late 90s, even when Toomey was touring with Primer, you had like bands that were touring together. What was that? The Pledge of Allegiance tour with Slipknot and System and
Mm-hmm.
and I forget who were the other two. American Head Charge and somebody else was on that bill as well. But it was a very like-minded tour. And obviously the big tours, the Ozfests and whatnot that were going on, they were like-minded bands for the very most part. And then somewhere along the way, it just changed to where it was like, well, we're going to make all the money, so we're going to make whoever buy onto the tour, and we really don't give a shit what they sound like. The people are just going to have to sit through an hour of them. Mm-hmm. And it's a crime, because what it's done is it has really shrunk the development of music. If you don't have labels doing any development and you're not experiencing new music, I mean, what's the last band either one of you remember discovering from seeing an old band? I think for me it was probably like Seven Dust, and that's 20 years ago at this point.
Yeah, no, and I think also, what I think's kind of missing too, I think these days is, I remember back in I think it was around 2000, you had like a tour. They don't have those tours anymore, right? Like I remember that Tattoo the Earth tour. I thought that was a phenomenal tour. I mean, there's so many bands on that second stage, and that's, for instance, where like Hatebreed really took off. They were on that tour. They were awesome. I mean, you just had had Hatebreed on there. You had bands like Amen. You had all these like sort of up and coming kind of bands, and then of course on your main stage you had Sepultura, you had Slipknot, you had Slayer. And I think that's what's kind of missing, right? Even Ozfest now isn't, it's not what it used to be. I mean, Ozfest was great for that too. They'd have that second stage, and they'd have all those, those new bands that just came out that were just signed, just released their records. But it gave, a mass audience a way to see these bands where instead of just going to clubs and doing it the old school way, I think, that's what's really missing, I think, too, is just, you don't see those tours around anymore. It's just, you just don't see them.
Yeah. Well, there's no one to pay for them.
Well, that's true. That's what it comes down to. Yeah, true.
There's no one fronting that $50,000 check to go on it. Instead, it's the marketing firm that works Cage the Elephant that throws that $50,000 to buy on. It sucks the way it is, but it just is that way now.
Yeah, no, for sure. All right, guys. Well, thanks for joining me here on the podcast tonight. We're going to go ahead and get ready to wrap this up, but why don't you guys go ahead and give us an update on what's going on with Talk to Me and the Classic Metal Show?
I'll go.
Anything? Go for it.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, obviously, I still do the Classic Metal Show every Saturday, 9 p.m. to 3 a.m. Eastern, theclassicmetalshow.com. We just launched a video service where you can watch us do the show, which is really thrilling. Cool. But if people want to check that out, there's a link to subscribe to it on the Classic Metal Show page. And, we do what we do. We talk a lot of stuff. I swear an awful lot. And, we talk about music and politics and sex and blah, blah, blah and everything. So
all the good stuff.
Fun.
All the good stuff, right?
It's fun. And it's definitely not for the weak, and it's definitely not for listening to at work.
Cool. All right. Well, Toomey, man. What about you?
Well, I've got the Talk to Me podcast, and that's my last name, Toomey. You can get it on any of your podcatchers, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, all that good stuff. I interview a lot of the new metal guys, but I also branch out and do the classic metal guys and all that stuff too. So recent interviews: David Silvera of Korn, Morgan from Kitty. Ricky Rackman was just on. That was a huge honor for me growing up as a Headbangers Ball kid. And then starting recently on uncontrollednoise.com, Talk to Me Live, 2-hour radio show, 8 p.m. Eastern to 10 p.m. Eastern, uncontrollednoise.com, Thursday nights. You can also hear me play some tunes, bring on interviews, and all that fun stuff too.
Awesome. And you just mentioned Headbangers Ball, and that's another, very, it's another thing that we're totally missing that this younger generation doesn't have access to is, think about how many times we've discovered bands just popping that thing on Saturday night and just watching that thing for a couple hours. How many bands did we discover back then? Numerous, right?
You don't think Vivo's a good alternative?
Not really, but
the one last kind of thing on this whole ordeal of scenes and pockets and everywhere around the country, the one thing that's eliminated all of that is the internet, is streaming services, is YouTube. Things can go viral, and a good song is a good song these days, no matter what. And the one example I have is actually kind of in the hip hop rap world, but this Lil Nas X with this the country, the Old Town Road song. That kid bought that beat for $30, threw it up on SoundCloud, and it just blew up. And now he's like a millionaire. And if you look at his Spotify, he has one song. And it's because it's a catchy ass song. You like it or not, it's an earworm. It gets stuck in your head, and it's crazy how you can do all of the theatrics and have all of the best guitar tones but at the end of the day, man, a good song is a good song. And I think that's maybe one thing 12 Volt never really had, was that one earworm. That's my favorite song. I love the chorus kind of thing, and I think that's the internet has leveled the playing field for all of us out there.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you. I think the song "Canceled" you guys had was, that's a great tune.
Well, I appreciate it.
Yeah,
it's
great. All right, well, guys, thanks again for joining us, and I'll speak to you guys later.
Thank you.
All right. Take care, guys.
Thanks. See you guys.
See you. Thank you for listening to the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast. Subscribe and listen to all episodes by going to our pages on iTunes, Spreaker, YouTube, Spotify, and more. You can listen to all other episodes and access up-to-date information and news on the Shockwave Skull Sessions podcast by going to our website at www.shockwaveskullsessions.com. Email all comments, questions, and suggestions to shockwaveskullsessions@gmail.com.